The sky was on fire. Plasma beams rained down from the massive Xal'Zur warships hovering in low orbit, turning entire city blocks into molten slag. Towers crumbled, bridges collapsed, and screams of the dying echoed through the streets of Zyphor Prime's last standing city, Velrath. The once proud capital of the Zyphoran people was now a battlefield, a graveyard in the making. General Kale stood atop a broken command tower, his armor scorched, his energy blade trembling in his grip. His forces were all but spent. The planetary shield had fallen hours ago, and now the enemy was everywhere. Xal'Zur ground troops, grotesque biomechanical creatures with razor-sharp limbs, swarmed through the burning ruins, slaughtering survivors without mercy. The defenders fought back with everything they had. Snipers took positions in shattered buildings, firing plasma rounds into the enemy hordes. Heavy cannons sent shockwaves through the streets, vaporizing clusters of the insectoid invaders. But for every Xal'Zur that fell, 10 more took its place. A nearby explosion sent Kale to his knees. Dust and debris clouded his vision, and when he looked up, he saw the remnants of his elite guard lying motionless. His second in command, Commander Vyrek, crawled toward him, blood leaking from a wound in his abdomen. They're pushing toward the command bunker, Vyrek gasped, clutching his side. Kale clenched his jaw. We can't hold them any longer. He activated his communicator, his voice grim. This is General Kale to all remaining forces. Fall back to the inner city. Defend the command bunker at all costs. The evacuation shuttles need more time. Static crackled in response. Most of his officers were dead. The few remaining soldiers fought on, not for victory, but for honor. Kale helped Vyrek to his feet, and together, they stumbled toward the bunker. Along the way, they passed the remnants of their people, civilians huddled in makeshift shelters, mothers clutching their children, elders too weak to flee. Their eyes held no hope. They knew what was coming. The Xal'Zur didn't take prisoners. Suddenly, the ground trembled as a Xal'Zur war beast, an enormous, multi-limbed monstrosity, crashed through a nearby building. Its mechanical eyes glowed red as it detected movement. With a shriek, it lunged, claws slicing through stone and steel. Kale barely had time to react before a squad of Zyphoran warriors charged in, plasma lances burning bright. They fought valiantly, driving their weapons into the creature's hide, but it was unstoppable. With a swipe of its massive limbs, it crushed them like insects. Kale pulled Vyrek behind cover and raised his weapon, knowing it was futile. The war beast turned toward them, its fanged maw opening. And then, out of nowhere, the sky erupted. A flash of blue light streaked down from the heavens, striking the beast's head with pinpoint precision. The creature convulsed, its limbs twitching, and then it collapsed, its body reduced to a pile of smoldering metal. Cal's breath caught in his throat. That wasn't Zyphoran weaponry. He looked up, blinking against the glare of the fires. Above them, past the Xal'Zur warships, a fleet of unknown vessels had just arrived. They were sleek, dark, and bristling with weapons. They moved like predators, darting through the chaos with unnatural speed. A crackling voice came through his communicator, speaking in a language he had only recently learned from intercepted transmissions. "This is Admiral Reynolds of the Terran Defense Fleet. We heard you needed some help." Cal's mind struggled to process what he was hearing. Humans. The humans were a minor species, barely known in the galactic hierarchy. They had no great empire, no vast armies, no ancient technology. Compared to the Xal'Zur, they were nothing. And yet here they were. The human warships engaged the Xal'Zur forces without hesitation. Their attack patterns were erratic, unpredictable, nothing like the disciplined formations of other galactic militaries. They fought like cornered beasts, striking fast, disappearing, and reappearing where they were least expected. Kale watched in disbelief as a squadron of human fighters broke through the Xal'Zur blockade. Instead of retreating, they went straight for the enemy's largest warship. They dodged plasma fire with unnatural precision, weaving between explosions, and then, shockingly, they rammed their ships into the Xal'Zur's exposed hangar base. Suicide tactics. No. Moments later, the human ships erupted in flames, but not before deploying robotic units that infiltrated the Xal'Zur vessel from within. The enemy warship began to malfunction, its weapon systems failing one by one. What kind of warriors are these? Vyric breathed. Kale didn't have an answer. More explosions filled the sky. The human fleet was small, but they were tearing through the Xal'Zur forces with an efficiency that defied logic. The Xal'Zur, for the first time in their reign of terror, were struggling. Then, another transmission came through. General Kale, your forces are in bad shape. We're sending ground reinforcements. Hold the line. Kale barely had time to react before metallic pods streaked down from the human ships, slamming into the battlefield with deafening force. The pods opened, and armored figures emerged, tall, heavily armed soldiers with glowing visors. The humans had landed. With brutal precision, they engaged the Xal'Zur ground forces. Their weapons were primitive compared to Zephyrin energy rifles, but they were devastatingly effective. High-impact ballistic rounds tore through the Xal'Zur's biomechanical armor, shredding them apart. Their soldiers moved with terrifying speed, clearing entire streets within minutes. And they didn't just fight with weapons. Kale saw one human, separated from his squad, leap onto the back of a Xal'Zur warrior, tearing out its control nodes with his bare hands. The Zyphorans had fought for centuries, but they had never seen anything like this. Hope surged in Cal's chest for the first time in days. He grabbed his communicator and spoke, his voice stronger than before. This is General Kale. To all remaining Zyphoran forces, fight. We are not alone. A roar erupted from the surviving defenders. Inspired by the arrival of their unexpected allies, the Zyphorans pushed forward. Together, humans and Zyphorans fought side by side, driving the Xal'Zur back for the first time in the entire war. The tide was turning. Kale looked up once more at the sky, where the human fleet clashed against the Xal'Zur's mighty warships. He didn't know why the humans had come, or what their true capabilities were, but one thing was clear. The galaxy had underestimated them, and now, the Xal'Zur were about to learn what it meant to make an enemy of humanity. The battlefield was chaos. Smoke and fire consumed the ruins of Velrath as the last of the Zyphoran defenders fought to hold their ground. The Xal'Zur forces had suffered losses, but they were still overwhelming in numbers, pressing forward with their biomechanical warriors. Their insectoid soldiers moved with terrifying precision, cutting down anything in their path. General Kale ducked behind a collapsed building, his chest heaving. His energy rifle hummed weakly in his hands, its power cell nearly drained. The humans had arrived, an unexpected miracle, but he was not yet convinced they could truly turn the tide. He had spent years studying war, and nothing he had ever seen suggested that this young species was capable of standing against the Xal'Zur. Then he heard it, a sound unlike any other on the battlefield. A deep, thunderous roar filled the air, cutting through the screams and explosions. It wasn't plasma fire. It wasn't energy-based at all. It was something old, something raw. Bullets. The human soldiers moved like predators, pushing forward through the battlefield with a level of aggression that stunned even Cal's warriors. Their weapons did not rely on energy beams or plasma charges, but instead fired solid projectiles, high-impact rounds that tore through Xal'Zur armor like it was nothing. Where Zephyrin energy weapons were elegant, precise, and tactical, human weapons were brutal, messy, and devastatingly effective. Kale watched as a group of human soldiers stormed a Xal'Zur defensive position. Instead of taking cover and exchanging fire like most soldiers would, they advanced relentlessly, their weapons spitting fire and steel. A Xal'Zur warrior lunged at them, its claws raised to strike. But before it could reach them, a single well-placed round from a human sniper took its head clean off. The humans didn't stop. They never stopped. Kel's communicator crackled again. "General Kale, this is Admiral Reynolds. Your forces are barely holding. Tell them to fall back behind our line. We'll handle the front." Kale hesitated. For years, the Zypherans had fought to protect their own. No other species had ever come to their aid, and the idea of stepping aside for these unknown warriors went against every instinct he had. But he couldn't deny what he was seeing. The humans weren't just here to help. They were here to win. He activated his communicator. "Zypheran forces, fall back behind the human advance. Let them take point." Some of his warriors hesitated, confused. But when they saw the humans pushing forward, refusing to yield even under heavy fire, they obeyed. They had no choice. They had been fighting for survival. Now, for the first time, they were fighting with an ally. The human tactics were unlike anything Kale had seen before. Their soldiers moved in small coordinated units, covering each other with deadly efficiency. They didn't rely on shields or energy barriers. Instead, they used speed, positioning, and sheer ferocity. Then came the aerial assault. Human dropships streaked overhead, their hulls painted in dark, jagged patterns. Unlike Zypheran transport ships, which were sleek and elegant, these looked like flying fortresses, armored, ugly, and terrifying. They roared over the battlefield, deploying squads of heavily armed soldiers who dropped directly into enemy-controlled zones. Kale watched in stunned silence as one of the dropships hovered just above a Xal'Zur command post. Instead of deploying troops in a careful, calculated manner, the humans jumped, leaping from the open doors, landing in the middle of the enemy lines with an impact that sent shockwaves through the ground. And then the real slaughter began. The Xal'Zur, who had always relied on their overwhelming numbers and superior technology, found themselves outmatched for the first time. The humans weren't fighting to hold the line. They were fighting to break it. One of the Xal'Zur war beasts, a towering, multi-limbed monstrosity, let out a shriek and charged a group of human soldiers. In response, a single figure stepped forward, a massive rifle resting on his shoulder. Kale recognized him from the human transmissions, Captain Bonner. Bonner didn't move as the beast charged. Instead, he calmly raised his weapon and fired a single deafening shot. The projectile, a high-velocity, armor-piercing round, punched straight through the beast's head, exiting through its back in an explosion of metal and organic matter. The creature collapsed instantly, its body twitching as the life drained from its cybernetic frame. Kale's warriors stared in shock. It had taken them dozens of fighters to bring down a single war beast in the past. Bonner had done it with one shot. The tide was turning. Above them, human warships engaged the Xal'Zur fleet with a level of aggression that defied all logic. Other species fought defensively, retreating when outmatched. The humans did the opposite. They attacked, throwing themselves into battle with a recklessness that should have been suicidal. And yet it was working. Kale watched as a group of human fighters dove straight into the heart of the Xal'Zur fleet, weaving between enemy fire with an unpredictability that no eye could anticipate. Instead of fighting from a distance, they closed in, too close for the Xal'Zur's long-range weapons to be effective. Then, in perfect synchronization, they fired concentrated bursts at the enemy's most vulnerable points. Engine cores, weapon arrays, sensor nodes. Within minutes, one of the Xal'Zur capital ships, an enormous dreadnought that had held the line over Velrath for weeks, began to break apart. Fires erupted along its hull. Explosions ripped through its structure. And then, in a final brilliant burst of light, it detonated, taking an entire squadron of Xal'Zur ships with it. The battlefield fell silent for a moment. The impossible had happened. The humans had destroyed a Xal'Zur dreadnought. Kale exhaled slowly. He had spent years watching his people suffer, believing that the war was lost. But now, standing in the burning ruins of Velrath, he realized something. The Xal'Zur weren't invincible. For the first time, the enemy was afraid. And it was because of them. Kale activated his communicator again, his voice filled with something he had not felt in a long time. Hope. This is General Kell to all forces. Advance. Push them back. We fight alongside the humans now. A roar erupted from the Zephyrin soldiers, and they surged forward, joining the human assault. They had been on the defensive for too long. Now they were fighting to win. As the battle raged on, Admiral Reynolds' voice came through the comms again. We're making progress, but it's not over yet. The Exalzer will retaliate. They always do. Cale narrowed his eyes, watching the enemy forces retreating in disarray. He knew Reynolds was right. The Exalzer would not accept defeat so easily. They would regroup, they would return, and they would be more dangerous than ever. But for now, in this moment, they had won a victory no one thought possible. And the galaxy was about to learn a terrifying truth. The Exalzer had ruled with fear, but humans fought with fury. The battlefield had fallen silent. Smoke still curled into the sky, and the ground was littered with the broken bodies of the Exalzer invaders. The combined forces of humanity and the Zephyrins had done the impossible. They had driven the Exalzer back. But General Cale knew better than to celebrate. The enemy had retreated, yes, but not in a way that signaled defeat. It wasn't panic. It wasn't fear. It was strategy. He stood on the shattered remains of Exalzer war beast, his gaze locked on the night sky. The enemy fleet had vanished into hyperspace, disappearing as suddenly as they had arrived. Nearby, Captain Bonner wiped the blood from his armor and stepped up beside him. "You're thinking the same thing I am," Bonner said, his voice grim. Cale nodded. This was just a battle, not the war. Bonner sighed and turned to his communicator. "Admiral, we need a full recon sweep. The Exalzer don't retreat without a reason." Admiral Reynolds' voice crackled through the comms. "Already on it. We've intercepted some of their encrypted transmissions. Something's not right. Get back to the command center. Now." Cale and Bonner exchanged a look. Without another word, they moved, their soldiers falling in line behind them. Inside the human command center, a hastily set up base within the ruins of Velrath. The room was filled with tense murmurs. Holographic displays showed star maps, battle footage, and intercepted enemy signals scrolling across the screens. At the center of it all stood Admiral Reynolds, his face unusually pale. "We decrypted the transmissions," Reynolds said, his jaw clenched. They weren't planning to wipe out the Zephyrins entirely. This attack was a distraction. Cale frowned. Distraction? From what? Reynolds turned, and the room grew deathly quiet as he pulled up the final decrypted message. The screen flickered, and then, in glowing red letters, 2 words appeared. Tar-Get, Earth. A cold silence filled the room. Even the Zephyrins, who had never set foot on Earth, felt the weight of those words. "They knew we'd come here," Bonner muttered. "They knew we'd fight." He clenched his fists. "They lured us away." Reynolds nodded. "And now Earth is defenseless." The Exalzer had studied humanity well. They had seen how fiercely humans fought, how recklessly they threw themselves into battle for their allies, and they had used that against them. The bulk of Earth's strongest warships were here, fighting for a world that wasn't theirs, while back home, billions of lives were left exposed. Cale stepped forward. "How much time do we have?" Reynolds exhaled sharply. "We don't know. The Exalzer fleet is faster than ours. They could already be there." For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of the realization settled in. Then Bonner slammed his fist against the table. "Then what the hell are we waiting for? We have to go. Now." Reynolds hesitated. "If we jump straight to Earth, we'll be walking into a slaughter. They wouldn't do this unless they had something new, something stronger." He gestured to the screens. "We need to know what we're up against first." Cale studied the human officers in the room. He could see it, the barely contained rage, the desperation. The Zypherans had lost everything, but humanity still had a chance to protect their home. And they weren't going to let it slip away. "I'll send scouts," Kale offered. "Zephyrin stealth ships are fast. We can get close enough to gather intel before we make our move." Reynolds nodded. "Do it." Minutes later, the Zephyrin scouts launched, vanishing into the darkness of space. The wait was agonizing. Every second felt like an eternity. Then, finally, a signal came through. "Admiral," the scout's voice was shaky. We have visual confirmation. Earth's defenses are being crushed." The Excelsior didn't send just a fleet. They sent something else. "Define something else," Reynolds demanded. A brief pause. Then the scout sent a data stream to the command center. The holographic display flickered, and the room fell into stunned silence as the image came into focus. A behemoth loomed over Earth, larger than any ship ever recorded. It wasn't just a warship. It was a planet killer. A massive Excelsior dreadnought, its surface covered in pulsating biomechanical armor, bristling with weapons strong enough to crack a planet's crust. Swarms of smaller ships poured from its underbelly, blackening the sky above Earth's cities. It wasn't an invasion anymore. It was extermination. Bonner's face darkened. "That thing is the size of a damn moon." The scout's voice returned, panicked. "They're deploying something. Some kind of energy weapon. It's charging up." The transmission cut out. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Reynolds took a deep breath. "That thing is going to wipe out Earth's surface. Billions will die if we don't stop it." Kale tightened his grip on his weapon. "Then let's stop it." Reynolds looked at the fleet display. "We don't have enough ships to take that thing head-on. Not in a direct fight." Bonner cracked his knuckles. "Then we don't fight fair." Kale saw something in the humans then, something terrifying and inspiring all at once. They had been outplayed. They had been tricked. And now, their home was in danger. But instead of fear, instead of despair, they were angry. The Excelsior had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated just how far humans were willing to go to win. Reynolds turned to the command crew. "We launch everything we have. Full speed to Earth. And once we're there," his eyes burned with determination, "we take that monster down, one way or another." Kale stepped forward. "Zyphoran forces will stand with you. Your home is our home now." Bonner smirked. "Then let's remind these bastards who they're messing with." The order was given. The human fleet, battered but unbroken, turned toward Earth. Engines roared as they jumped into hyperspace, racing against death itself. Every soldier on board knew the truth. This was humanity's last stand. If they failed, Earth would fall. The Excelsior thought they had won, but they had just awakened something far worse. They had made humans angry. The void of space trembled as the human fleet emerged from hyperspace. Ahead of them, Earth was barely visible, its surface covered by the shadow of the Excelsior's monstrous dreadnought. The planet killer loomed over the world like a god of death, its biomechanical hull pulsing with energy as it prepared to unleash devastation. Admiral Reynolds gripped the edge of the command console. "All ships, full speed ahead. Weapons free. We don't let that thing fire." The fleet surged forward, guns blazing. Streams of kinetic rounds, plasma bolts, and missile barrages streaked toward the Excelsior ships, igniting explosions across the battlefield. But the enemy was ready. Swarms of insectoid fighters poured out of the dreadnought, forming a living shield around it. Inside his dropship, Captain Bonner clenched his jaw. "They're trying to slow us down. We need to get a team inside that thing." General Kale's voice crackled through the comms. "Zephyrin strike teams are standing by. We will lead the charge." Bonner smirked. "Good. Let's kick down the door." As the main battle raged, a squad of human and Zephyrin ships weaved through the chaos, heading straight for a weak point in the dreadnought's defenses. The Excelsior fired relentlessly, but the pilots dodged and juked, avoiding destruction by mere meters. Finally, Bonner's dropship crashed onto the dreadnought's hull, skidding to a stop. The doors blew open, and the strike team poured out, weapons raised. The Exalzer were waiting. A wave of biomechanical warriors charged at them, claws gleaming in the dim red glow of the ship's interior. The battle was brutal, fought in tight corridors where every step was a fight for survival. Bonner's shotgun roared, tearing through enemy armor. Kale's energy blade slashed through the Exalzer ranks, his soldiers fighting with unmatched fury. They pushed forward, deeper into the dreadnought. Then they saw it. The core. A massive, pulsating heart of energy at the center of the ship. It was charging, preparing to unleash a planet-destroying blast. If they didn't stop it now, Earth would be reduced to ashes. Bonner turned to his team. "Plant the charges. We blow this thing to hell." Explosives were set along the core's structure. The countdown began, but the Exalzer weren't finished. A towering warlord stepped forward, its chitinous armor gleaming. "You cannot win," it growled. "Humanity's end is inevitable." Bonner grinned. "Funny. We were just about to say that to you." The fight was brutal. The warlord was fast, its strikes powerful enough to dent steel. But Bonner was faster. He dodged, countered, and with a final blast from his shotgun, he sent the warlord sprawling. Kale drove his blade through its chest, ending it for good. The charges beeped. 10 seconds left. "Time to go," Bonner shouted. The team sprinted back to the dropship. The moment they were clear, the core erupted. A chain reaction tore through the dreadnought, ripping it apart from the inside. The Exalzer ships faltered, their forces collapsing without their command structure. From his command ship, Admiral Reynolds watched the explosion light up space. "All ships, mop up the stragglers. We're finishing this." The battle ended with the last Exalzer ship burning in the void. The war was over. Bonner stepped onto Earth's soil, breathing in the air. Kale stood beside him. "You humans," Kale said, shaking his head, "you never give up." Bonner smirked. "No, we don't." The Exalzer had thought they were the apex predators of the galaxy. They had thought humanity was just another species to crush under their heel. They had been wrong. And now, the galaxy knew the truth. Humanity was not to be underestimated. Ever again. The Exalzer dreadnought was breaking apart, but it wasn't going down quietly. Fires raged across its massive hull, and explosions tore through its structure as the chain reaction from the detonated core spread. Yet deep within its failing systems, something even deadlier was happening. Bonner's dropship raced through the crumbling corridors of the enemy vessel, its engines straining against gravity as the ship fought to escape the blast zone. Kale and his Xypheran warriors stood alongside the human strike team, gripping the ship's rails as alarms blared. Then the warning came. "Captain," the pilot's voice was frantic. "The dreadnought is triggering a final failsafe. It's not just exploding, it's self-destructing in a controlled detonation. If it goes off, the entire sector will be wiped out, including Earth." The words sent a cold shock through Bonner's veins. "Can we stop it?" The pilot hesitated. "Maybe, but only from inside." Bonner exchanged a glance with Kale. They both knew what that meant. Someone had to stay behind. Kale tightened his grip on his blade. "I will do it." Bonner shook his head. "No way. You and your people lost your world. I'm not letting you die before you get a chance to rebuild." Kale stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. Bonner turned to his team. "Get to the AVEX ships. That's an order." The soldiers hesitated. They had fought alongside him, bled alongside him. But they knew arguing was useless. One by one, they saluted. Kale stepped closer. "You don't have to do this alone." Bonner smirked. "I know, but someone's got to make sure the job gets done right." He turned, running back toward the heart of the dreadnought, as his team was forced to leave without him. The moment Bonner reached the control center, he got to work. Sparks rained from above, and the floor trembled beneath him. He hacked into the Xalzur systems, his fingers flying over the alien interface. The timer ticked down. 3 minutes. A transmission crackled through his comm. "Bonner, it's Reynolds. What the hell are you doing?" "Making sure we win," Bonner said. "Tell everyone back home. We did it." There was a long silence. Then Reynolds' voice, strained. "Godspeed, soldier." Bonner smirked, looking at the countdown. 2 minutes left. The Xalzur had believed they were unstoppable, that no one would dare challenge them. But they had never met humans. They had never known what humanity was willing to sacrifice to win. As the countdown hit 0, Bonner closed his eyes. The last thing he heard was the roar of the explosion. And then, silence. On Earth, the sky lit up as the Xalzur dreadnought was consumed in a blinding blast. The battlefield fell silent. The war was over. But the victory had come at a cost. Kale stood among the human soldiers, watching the burning sky. He had fought many wars, lost many friends. But this loss cut deeper than any before. A transmission came through. Admiral Reynolds, his voice heavy. "We won." But there was no celebration, no cheers, only the quiet mourning of those who had fought alongside a man who had given everything. Bonner was gone. And yet, his sacrifice had ensured that Earth lived, that humanity endured. Kale placed a hand over his heart. "We will not forget." Neither would the galaxy. Because on this day, the universe learned a lesson. Humanity was not just a species. They were a force. The war was over, but the scars remained. Earth had survived. The Xalzur had been defeated. Their monstrous dreadnought, their fleet, their reign of terror, all of it had been reduced to debris floating in the void. Yet the cost of victory weighed heavily on every soldier, every survivor. The galaxy had changed forever, and at the heart of it all stood humanity. On the surface of Earth, the ruins of once great cities were being rebuilt. Fires had been extinguished, the wounded were being treated, and the dead were being mourned. A solemn silence hung over the command center as Admiral Reynolds stood before a holographic display. Names scrolled across the screen, those who had fallen in battle. Among them, one name stood out, Captain Bonner. Reynolds took a deep breath, his hand tightening into a fist. The man had died ensuring their survival. It wasn't just his name on that list. It was a reminder of the sacrifice that had brought them to this moment. The door behind him slid open. General Kale stepped inside, his Xipheran armor still scorched from battle. Though his people had suffered unimaginable loss, they had found something they never expected, a home. "Your people fought bravely," Kale said, his voice steady but filled with respect. Reynolds exhaled. "We didn't have a choice." He turned, studying the alien warrior. "And neither did you. The Xipherans have lost their world. What happens now?" Kale looked out the window, where human engineers worked alongside Xipheran soldiers, rebuilding, creating something new. "We have fought alongside you. We have blood beside you. If you will have us, we will stand with you. Not as refugees, as allies." Reynolds nodded. "Then welcome to the Terran Alliance." The words carried weight. In that moment, it became clear. Humanity was no longer alone in the galaxy. Days turned to weeks, and the survivors of the war came together to forge a new path. The Terran Alliance was born, uniting humanity and the surviving Xipherans. But it wasn't just about Earth. News of the Xalzur's defeat spread across the stars. Other species, once living in fear, now saw humanity in a new light. They were no longer just another race in the cosmos. They were a power. On the Galactic Council, an ancient assembly of species that had long watched from the sidelines, leaders debated what to do about the rise of humanity. Some feared them. Others saw them as saviors. But no one could deny what had happened. The Xalzur had been an unstoppable force. And yet, Humanity had stopped them. In the heart of a newly constructed space station, high above Earth, a gathering took place. Representatives from dozens of species stood together, waiting for the man who had led humanity through the fire. The doors opened, and Admiral Reynolds stepped forward, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. He looked over the crowd. Aliens, warriors, leaders, survivors. All of them had come for one reason: because humanity had earned their place. Reynolds cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the hall. The war is over, but the fight is not. We will rebuild. We will stand together. And we will ensure that no empire like the Xal'Zur ever rises again. Silence. Then, slowly, one by one, the gathered leaders nodded. Some raised their hands. Others simply bowed their heads. But the message was clear. A new era had begun, and at its center stood the race that had refused to break. The race that had risen from the ashes. The race that had changed the fate of the galaxy. Humanity.